All right, so let's do the next bit, which is the levels of the central nervous system. So, like I said, this is about the brain and the spinal cord. Um, Sorry about that. Okay, so when we talk about the brain, um, we have three main components, which are the forebrain, and then we have the midbrain, and then we have the hindbrain. And then when we talk about components of the spinal cord, we have the brainstem, which is composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And then we have just behind or on the side of these three components, the cerebellum. And then we have the spinal cord proper. I like calling it that. Not that is the scientific term, but we have the cervix, the cervical area, thoracic area, lumbar, and then sacral. So the spinal cord itself function is known for working local blood vessel control, GIT movement, urinary excretion, among others, while the lower part of the brain or the subcortex, which is really the medulla, the pons, the thalamus, cerebellum, basal ganglia, components like that are known to maintain arterial pressure, respiratory responses, feeding reflexes, and central pattern generation, which we will talk about as we go on in the course. The lower brain also initiates this state of awake, which I hope you are as you are listening to this class. And then it also enforces or reinforces the processing of memories. That is the remembering loop. Um, we're also coming back to that later on. And then we have the higher brain centers, which are a large storage house, never functions alone, very dependent on the lower centers, and is really for precision of operation and essential for thought processing. Okay, so in the next slide, I am going to explain a few more neuroanatomical functional components. Um, so when we talk about the brainstem, if you remember, I'm just trying to show another component of it where we are talking about the midbrain. Remember, I showed it in this view where we had several components shown in a particular order. So I'm gonna go through them, but using different pictures. So the one on my left is you have the purple looking structure plus the deep purple and then the midbrain itself. So you have the thalamus, the midbrain, and the hypothalamus forming. You can't see them quite here, but those form what is known as the diencephalon. Then the midbrain itself, the pons, the medulla oblongata, they form the brainstem, and you have several cranial nerves around this area. um, the anatomist will come and redo this component and ensure that you know what comes after what and how each part looks like. Um, on the component named hindbrain, I think here, aside from how the midbrain looks like uh, from this angle, I'd like to also just bring out the fact that we have components that are very vital in sleeping, such as the pineal gland, with the thalamus being the gateway to the brain. And we have various components here, the colliculi, inferior, superior, which we'll come back and refer to as we are talking about how the nerves move up and down the spinal cord. And then we have our entire medulla. So the medulla, the pons, the midbrain, all of this is forming what is known as the brain stem. Okay. Okay, let's see if we can do just a brief, more anatomical type of learning. So here we are going to label the cerebral hemispheres, the diencephalon, and this is coming from your anatomy lectures. Just want to see if you can remember. And from the little bit that I've said, I want you to name from here the midbrain, the cerebellum, the pons, the medulla, and the spinal cord. So this is a think, and then you're just going to share after that. If you can pair up, fine, pair up. Okay, pause the video and let's try to do that. Okay, so I hope you named that area as spinal cord. And then above it is the medulla. Then you have the pontine area, which has the cerebellum right behind it, and the midbrain above the pontine area. Finally, you have the diencephalon, which is right above the midbrain area, and then the cerebral hemisphere, which is the big guy. So I hope that is what you had discussed with your friend. Another view of this is, I'm just gonna leave this here so that you appreciate some of the ventricles that you learned in your anatomy. Okay, so you could just pause the video. I'll play this so that you just see it from every angle. Okay, so it's showing the ventricle system. And if you can label this as well, that will do you good for your revision. Okay, all right. So that's another angle, and we are back. Okay. All right. So we're gonna skip that, and again, I'm really just showing you all the views possible, and the anatomists do such a lovely job when it comes to this. And we'll show you how each of these parts function and how they operate. All right, so here is an exercise. I want you to choose correctly the sequence the brain regions move rostral to caudal. So you have to know what rostral means and you have to know what caudal means from your anatomy. So which choice correctly sequences the brain regions from rostral to caudal? I'm going to pause and allow you to pick green, pink, yellow, orange. And before you move on to the next 30 seconds where I show the answer, just write down what it is you think you is the correct answer. So the correct answer is, so rostral to caudal, we're talking from up to down, so to speak. So it's the thalamus, which moves to the midbrain, which moves to the pontine area, and then you have the medulla. So I hope that's what you picked. All right. So when it comes to the spinal cord, like I said, we are dividing it into the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and we also have the coccygeal region. And each of these have specific numbers or vertebrae that are associated to them. And the spinal nerves leave the vertebral column through what is known as the intervertebral foramina, and you have the sensory component entering through the dorsal root and the motor commands by efferent axons through the ventral root. Again, most of these components are going to be repeated in anatomy, but what I would love for you to pay extra attention to as you are discussing these in anatomy is what is the role of the spinal meninges in the spinal cord area. Uh, as you go through this lesson, please answer that question for me. And this is just another view showing you the coverings. Again, this is more anatomical, but on this one, what I would like you to appreciate are the dorsal root. So the dorsal root ganglion is where you have the sensory components going into the spinal cord, and coming out through the ventral root is the spinal is the efferent, which are the motor components. Now we're just going to delve in a little bit and learn a little bit more about the spinal cord cross-sectional. So when we look at the cross-sectional view of the spinal cord, we see that it is gray white matter that is uh, found in it, and it forms a specific patterns. Now, first of all, I would like to draw you to only the functional parts, and then the anatomy guys will come in and sort of delve into the nitty-gritties. Right at the center of it is the central canal, also known as the central cavity. Then you have this butterfly-like structure, and when you look at it, it looks gray. I know that my picture is brown, but it looks grayish because it is filled with cell bodies, dendrites, and acts and terminals. So because there's so much of the inside of cells happening here, it is dense, it is more intense looking. And then surrounding it, so maybe before I go to what surrounds it, what I should say is in this gray area, you have the somas and you have the synapses that are happening right in here. And then surrounding it is this now whitish matter, which is composed mostly of the fibers themselves, and these could be descending or ascending. So when you critically look at the gray component, it's got two types of horns. Now, the back here, the dorsal, has these horns that receive sensory stimulation, hence the dorsal root that we talked about. So the dorsal component, or this posterior half, is known for sensory synapsing, whilst the anterior component or ventral component of this gray part of the gray matter is actually for motor neurons that leave the spinal cord to go and synapse on particular areas to cause motor movements. So that is what I want you to get out of this picture. Here we're really looking at it from another angle, and I could start from my far right, where you have the dendrites of a sensory neuron moving into towards the spinal cord, and then of course this is the direction of the action potential. It will move along this way, and there is this ganglion where you have the somatic bodies there, because if you do remember, your sensory neurons have this central axon, and they have this peripheral axon, and then they have their soma right in the middle. So the ganglion in which they are housed is known as the dorsal root ganglion, and then it goes to synapse, and in very specific order, synapses in the gray component that we talked about. And sometimes they could be an interneuron, it could directly synapse on a motor neuron, but in this case, we have this interneuron where synapsing is taking place. And then we have a motor neuron coming out of the ventral component, and then it will go and it will take an effect on a motor neuron. Um, and so this is again just another picture depiction of what we're talking about. All right, repetition does not grow old. This one is also showing the same. We have the sensory neuron, which is coming in, and the sensory nerve. So the sensory neuron, and then the nerve itself has this dorsal root ganglion, or which is a swelling over here, um, which contains the soma, and goes and synapses in the gray matter. Now we can stop calling it the gray thingy. So in the gray matter, it's synapses, and after synapsing, we see that there is an interneuron also here, which synapses on the motor neuron, and this motor neuron then takes its effect on muscles that need to, carry out a motor movement. And this is coming through the ventral root. And the surrounding, of course, we have the white matter. Okay, so I will end my lecture by coming back to this picture over here. But what I want you to draw from here is we have a very simple organization of the dorsal ventral sensory motor type of relationship. So here behind we have this sensory and the green part, which is the motor. So that's what I would want you to, recall. Okay. As we move on, I would like to remind you also that we are putting into consideration the major parts of the brain, which are the back part, the occipital, parietal, right on top, on the sides, temporal, and in front, frontal. Do not forget those. How do people know what function comes from what part? So they've observed which part of the brain lights up when something is done or when something is sensed, and they then mapped or identified which parts of the brain are in charge of those functions. So, for example, when you're looking at words, there's a particular part of the brain that lights up, which is different from speaking the words, which is different from listening to them, and then we have a whole bigger component lighting up when you're actually thinking of the words. So in this way, people have been able to understand parts of the brain that are in charge of various components of function. We have already done this, but again, I would like to show you something new here. Here we now have this sulcus right in the middle, known as the central sulcus. And the central sulcus has in front of it a precentral gyrus, which is in charge of motor activities. And right behind it is the postcentral gyrus, that is also known as the somatic sensory cortex, and this is part of sensations. And remember, I say that the representations of body parts that are in the brain, this is where you have that map of your body. So this is now somatotopic area, or somato, no, I won't have another word for that, but it has a map of your body, and in order for you to sense something, that part of your body is gonna get lit up, or the action potentials are gonna go to that part. In order for you to do something, you're going to have components of action potentials, after thinking, of course, emerging from that part and then going down. Okay. So one thing that you should know and understand from the get-go is, whilst we are discussing all of this, we'll be talking about specific patterns of how these fibers move from the time that you sense the information. What part of the gray matter is it going to synapse on, and how is it going to move through the spinal cord until it gets to the sensory cortex, and which part of the sensory cortex is it going to synapse on? Okay. And if it is another type of sensation, Is it going to use a specific, and we're going to emphasize the fact that it's going to use a specific route. Sorry, let's go back to the previous one. If it's another type of sensation, we're going to specify that's going to use a different type of route. Instead of the dorsal column, medial, and meniscus, it's going to use another one where it immediately crosses the spinal cord to the other side when it enters the spinal cord, instead of first going up as seen here, and then only splitting up when it reaches a specific component of the higher parts of the spinal cord. Uh, when we talk about the motor, we're going to talk about how action potentials move from the motor cortex through a specific area down in a very specified way to go and influence a specific muscle so that a specific motor activity happens. Right. So let's try to bring this together. We have the frontal lobe, and then we have the central sulcus right in here. Before that, we have a gyrus that is in charge of motor activities. Behind it, we have the one that is in charge of sensation. Then you have the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes, and then the cerebellum right at the back. Let's try to play this video and just see it in action. So it will actually cut it so that you see how it looks like when we have that view. So that's now cutting into the various areas, and it's moving in a specific way. And you have another component that moves in a specific way, and we will learn at one point that there is this definite movement from one side of the brain to the other, hence noting that left controls right and right controls left. And going back to the first question that I asked you of that man who had a stroke. Okay, so this is where we end our video. In the next video, we're going to look at neurons and glial cells.